This is Dr. Rebecca Johansson, running and triathlon coach with the Performance Project. You can find us at theperformance-project.com. Today's sports science mini lecture is on the 10% rule, fact or fiction. When I was doing my PhD at the University of Cape Town, I was studying training load and endurance runners. And what we were seeing was that the 10% rule didn't really make sense as we were analyzing the data. So I was sitting in my supervisor's office and I asked Professor Mike Lambert, what's the origin of the 10% rule? How did this even come to be? Because we've seen it in so many publications. And Mike told me to contact Amby Burfoot. And he said, if anybody knows, he would. So I emailed Amby Burfoot, who was the 1968 Boston Marathon champion, and he's also a running journalist, been editor of Runner's World and written multiple books on running. And Amby emailed me back and he said, I believe it was Dr. Joan Ulyott who first wrote about it in the 1970s. And he mentioned, it wasn't based on any scientific evidence, though. It wasn't based on research study. It was just advice at the time. So I contacted Dr. Joan Ulyott and I said, Amby believes you're the first person to write about the 10% rule. And she messaged me back and said, yep, I believe I was the first one that wrote about it. And Joan is a runner and medical doctor, and she's an author, and she wrote multiple books specifically targeted at women in the 1970s to get women involved in endurance running. And Joan had 3 rules of 10s. So it was quite ingenious. It was just very simple rules to follow. So the first one was the 10-year rule, and that was no matter what age you started running, you could improve your running times for a period of 10 years. And the second rule of 10 was the 10% mileage rule. So you shouldn't increase your mileage by any more than 10% per week. And then the third one was that no more than 10% of your running mileage or running time should be run at high intensity. So this was, very practical advice targeted to novice female runners who were just getting into running. And it was also based on personal experience. So Joan had suffered a number of running injuries, and this was advice that she adhered to, and it worked for her to keep her injury free. So this is really an example of practical advice in the 1970s geared towards novice runners that has spiraled into this hard and fast rule that gets applied to all different levels of runners and even gets published as advice in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So that gets to be a bit problematic. So what I'm going to do is present a case study from my PhD data. So what we did was, this was one participant and we've got 2 graphs. So in graph A, that's looking at 6 months of training, and I calculated the percent change in training load from week to week. So this would be based on Joan's advice, the 10% rule. And then the shaded region is just highlighting the plus or minus 10%. And then in graph B, I did a different type of calculation. So we've got 24 weeks of training at 6 months. And then on the y-axis, we've got percent change in training load. But instead of calculating it percent change from week to week, I calculated the relative weekly change in training load versus the preceding largest week of training load values. So this, so in week 1, that's the relative change compared to the first week, and then from then we just look at the change compared to the preceding largest week. And this was a 46-year-old male runner who did 6 months of training, and he was following a periodized training program to peak for a marathon race in week 20. So on the x-axis in week 20. And when we look at graph A, when we just look at the percent change from week to week, it looks like this runner was training completely random. And then the percent increases when we've got positive values. It's like at 70%. The largest one is 130%. So that's by far not in line with the 10% rule whatsoever. But then when we look at graph B, when we calculated it in a different way, we can see that the data makes a lot more sense. So when the athlete was having big weeks of training, it looks like the peak increase was just over 20% compared to the previous largest week. So that to me makes a lot more sense. And in this study, we had about 30 participants, and the data was pretty consistent across participants. We saw that, about 20% was a reasonable increase in training volume compared to the preceding largest week. And especially because they weren't doing that from week to week to week. They would have an increase in 20% for maybe 1 to 3 weeks in a row, and then they would have a recovery week. So it's really important to think about these calculations and not just say, okay, 10% rule. And I really do believe that calculating percent changes in training load compared to the largest week of training that they've done in whatever, periodized training program that they've been in is the better calculation.